A longtime presenter who couldn't be with us for the conference this year due to a personal conflict, Bob Robichaud, VE1MBR, has put together a short video that will show to talk about some of the impacts. We talked a little bit about how we've had an interesting new Hurricane Alley in the Canadian Maritimes the last few years. And so we've done a lot of work with Bob and amateur radio operators in Canada for some of these hurricane events. And I live in Massachusetts. I'm from New England, and we always get nervous when we see these systems going just over to the Canadian Maritimes, because shift that track about 150 miles, 200 miles or so, and it's in New England's lap. And our last landfalling hurricane in New England was Hurricane Bob in 1991. So we are a little bit overdue, so we're always watching the tropics. And I'm not even going to talk about what Josh has going on during the middle of hurricane season. But anyways, let me put up the video from Bob Robichaud. He's going to talk again about the Canadian Hurricane Center and a little bit about the future hurricane season for this year.
Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this year's National Hurricane Conference. My name is Bob Robichaud, and I'm a meteorologist with the Canadian Hurricane Center. I'm not able to be with you this year, but I have recorded this short video to kind of go over what we might expect for this hurricane season. So what I'm going to cover is just give you a brief overview of what we do at the Canadian Hurricane Center. We'll look at some of the factors that influence this year's hurricane season, and we'll look at some of the early outlooks that are already been issued for this coming season. So at the Canadian Hurricane Center, we're not there to duplicate what they do at the National Hurricane Center in Miami, but we work very closely with them. We issue track and intensity forecasts for tropical cyclones that are expected to have an impact in Canada. We also work very closely with the National Hurricane Center. We get on video calls when we have an approaching storm. We do some training together. We've gone down there a number of times, and they have come up here to attend some of our sessions as well. We work very closely also with the amateur radio community. We have good working relationships with WX4NHC, the VOIP Hurricane Net, and the Hurricane Watch Net, just to name a few, as well as our CanWarn folks here in Canada. So I just wanted to kind of dive into what factors are affecting this hurricane season. The two that we look at a lot are wind shear in the tropical Atlantic and water temperature in the tropical Atlantic as well, because that's what provides these storms with the fuel they need to grow to the intensity that they can reach. So we'll start with wind shear. If we look at the profile of wind shear over the course of the year in the graphic here on the right, the shaded area is essentially hurricane activity throughout the year. The green area in here is hurricane season, which starts in June and runs till the end of November. So we see that the peak of hurricane season is typically in early September. On average, if we look at all the storms in the Atlantic Basin over a long period of time. And if we look at the profile of wind shear, we tend to have more wind shear in the wintertime, but that drops off significantly as we head into the summer, bottoming out sometime in August. And the temperature profile of the water, the sea surface temperature, that rises during the summer and peaks towards the end of September. And it's right between these two peaks that we get the statistical peak of hurricane season, which is around September 10th. So wind shear and water temperature play a significant role. Now, one of the things that we look at for wind shear is whether we have an El Nino, which is warm water in the Pacific, or a La Nina, which is cold water in the Pacific. When we have warmer water in the Pacific or an El Nino, we have more wind shear in the Atlantic, meaning typically fewer hurricanes. When we have colder water in the equatorial Pacific, we tend to have less wind shear in the Atlantic, and as a result, more tropical cyclone activity in the Atlantic as well. So the indicator for that we look at is water temperature in the Pacific. And in terms of water temperature in the Atlantic, that's fairly straightforward. We look at sea surface temperatures and how that differs from the long-term average to give us an idea of what the activity might be. So let's start by taking a look at that. This is sea surface temperature anomaly. This taking you back here to May of 2022. We see that in the Pacific, the water in this rectangle here, which is generally the area that we look at, was below average. So in blue was below average, so colder than average. Whereas in the Atlantic, the water temperatures were slightly above average, but there was a large area that was pretty close to average at the start of hurricane season that year. And that in comparison to what we saw last year, we were heading towards a moderate La Nina or El Nino last year, where the water temperatures were warmer in the equatorial Pacific. But in the Atlantic, they were also warmer as well. And we actually reached some record water temperatures in parts of the Atlantic last summer. So this was towards May of last year. If we look at the situation now, still looking at warmer water in the Pacific, but the Atlantic is even warmer than it was last year. This is last year. This is this year. So even warmer this year compared to the record season of last year. But there's also this little blue patch here that's starting to develop, meaning that the water in this general area is starting to cool. So we may be heading towards, or at least heading out of that El Nino situation that we had last year. So if we look at the predictions for that, this is the water predictions of water temperature anomaly. Anything in the red above 0.5 degrees is considered an El Nino. So where we are now and where we are going. All the models that we can look at are indicating that we will be moving out of this El Nino, which tends to dampen hurricane activity in the Atlantic, into either a neutral situation, which is between 0.5 and minus 0.5, or actually in a full-on La Nina by the time we reach the peak of hurricane season, which is August, September, and October. That's the period that is important to look at. So if we look at the official forecast for that, the official forecast issued by NOAA here in March is for 71% chance that we will be in a La Nina, meaning that wind shear tends to be lower, allowing for more storms to develop. Now let's take a look at water temperature in the Atlantic. Again, this is where the storms get their fuel. This is water temperature anomaly that I presented last year at the conference in early April. There was a fairly significant area of warmer water. But if we look at where we are this year, this is as of this week, much warmer than even last year was, where last year was a very warm season for water temperature in the Atlantic. So looking at this another way, this is the trace of average water temperature in the entire North Atlantic between 1981 and last year, with last year being in orange. You can see just how much warmer we were in the Atlantic this year. And that spilled over into this year, because if we look at where we are now, we're already warmer than what we were last year in the Atlantic. So now we have, where last year we had the two competing factors, the warm water in the Atlantic and the El Nino. If we head towards another La Nina situation, that would favor that we would have two things favoring a very active hurricane season. If we look at the predictions for water temperature anomaly in the Atlantic, this is from our seasonal model, our Canadian seasonal model. Very clear indication, strong signal of warm waters to continue in the Atlantic this year. And again, we're above average, even above where we were last year at this time. Another thing we look at is the active phase of what we call the MAO. And basically what we look at is There have been periods of active and less active phases as far as hurricane activity goes in the Atlantic. We have been in an active phase now since 1995, and there are no signs that we will be exiting that phase anytime soon. So if we look at all the major factors, certainly water temperature is certainly a big one, and we're looking at potentially even record water temperatures in the Atlantic again this summer. In terms of wind shear, if we go towards that La Nina situation, it will definitely be an active year. And again, we're still in that Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation active phase. So everything points to a very active season in the Atlantic this year. Some of the predictions that have already been issued, tropical storm risk is one that we look at. They issued their preliminary outlook in December, and they're calling for 20 named storms, 9 hurricanes. Colorado State, they come out with theirs next week. Weather Bell, which is a private company, they've predicted as much as 30 named storms and 14 to 16 hurricanes. The folks in Europe that run the ECMWF model, they have an outlook that goes up to the end of September. And by that time, they have 17 named storms and 9 hurricanes. And we know that when we get into these hyperactive seasons, October and early November are still active. So that those numbers would add to this. And then finally, NOAA, they come out with their outlook towards the end of May. And there are about 20 to 30 agencies that or companies that issue these outlooks. And you can see how all these numbers that have already been issued compared to the average number of storms and hurricanes for an average year. So I would not be surprised if some of these outlooks, as they start to come out now over the next number of weeks, have some of the most aggressive uh, predictions for the number of storms in the Atlantic that we've ever seen, given that everything is lining up the way it's lining up. So the names for this year, again, this is the list that we're going to use, and we used this list back in 2018. That was the last time we used this list. And at that time, we had Florence and Michael that were retired. So they've been replaced by Francine and Milton. And then we also have the supplemental list that we may have to use this year, that we haven't had to really delve into since this list was created. But this might be the year that we have to use some of those names that replace the Greek alphabet that we used to use. So with that, thank you very much for your attention. I'd just like to, again, thank you for all your work and your observations that we get. Sometimes you may not know how valuable your piece of information is to us to help complete that picture of what's going on with a specific storm. So keep those reports coming in. Thank you very much for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.